There is this massive contradiction right at the heart of modern life.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, if you look at the data over the past decade, global anxiety and depression rates have shot up by like nearly 30%.
Yeah, it's staggering.
Right. We have more material wealth, more comfort, more access to wellness apps than any humans in history.
Mm-hmm.
But we are experiencing this silent global mental health pandemic.
And we keep trying to solve it with the exact wrong tool.
Exactly. Usually when we talk about being in control of ourselves, there's this assumption that we are, the CEO of our own brains. Like you feel a surge of anger at work or a wave of panic about the future, and you just tell yourself to calm down.
You expect your brain to just listen.
Yeah. You think you are the master of your emotions, relying on willpower and rational thought to steer the ship out of the storm.
Which is a very comforting illusion, We love the idea that we can simply think our way out of a feeling, mostly because it gives us a sense of agency in a world filled with chronic stressors. But when we actually look at the neurological architecture of the brain, that assumption just falls apart completely.
Which is exactly why we're plunging into this today. We have a fascinating stack of research in front of us for this deep dive.
It's incredible stuff.
It really is. It's anchored by a groundbreaking collection called Advances in Emotion Regulation, from neuroscience to psychotherapy. And our mission today is to decode the actual biological hardware of human suffering and healing.
We're looking under the hood.
Right. This is a gritty, anti-common sense look at brain electricity, evolutionary design flaws, and just the absolute mechanical reality of what happens inside your head when you suffer. We are not talking about deep breathing or like the power of positive thinking here.
No, far from it. I mean, the research we're looking at essentially rewrites everything we thought we knew about anxiety, depression, and trauma.
It really does.
It shows us that willpower is basically a bystander in a silent, high-stakes war happening deep inside your skull.
So let's start right there with this idea of willpower just being a bystander. Because society tells us from a very young age that if you can't control your temper or, if you can't stop crying when you're overwhelmed, you are weak. You lack discipline.
Right, the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality.
Exactly. But the science seems to suggest that conscious, rational regulation of our emotions isn't the primary driver at all. It's almost like a biological afterthought.
Yeah, to understand why our willpower so often fails us in the heat of the moment, we have to look at the two distinct pathways the brain uses to manage emotion.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Researchers categorize these as the explicit system and the implicit system. So explicit emotion regulation is the one you're familiar with.
That's the conscious one.
Right. It is what you are doing when you consciously, effortfully try to change how you feel. It's you saying to yourself, I shouldn't be mad about this email, or I need to stop worrying about tomorrow's presentation.
That's the CEO trying to issue orders to the rest of the body.
Exactly. And that explicit system is housed primarily in the dorsal areas of the brain. We're talking specifically about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which handles high-level cognitive planning, and the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, which helps allocate your attention.
Okay.
But the vast majority of our emotional management, and I mean well over 90% of it, happens implicitly.
Wait, over 90%?
Yes, it happens automatically, entirely outside of your conscious awareness.
So most of the time my brain is calming itself down or reacting. I don't even know what's happening.
Long before you have consciously registered that you were stressed, your implicit system has already detected the threat, evaluated it, and deployed chemical and electrical countermeasures to keep you stable.
Wow.
This automatic pilot is driven by the ventral prefrontal cortex. This includes areas like the orbitofrontal cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. This system is ancient, it is incredibly fast, and it is overwhelmingly dominant.
Okay, so if the ventral prefrontal cortex is doing 90% of the heavy lifting implicitly, then trying to use the explicit system, my conscious willpower, to stop a massive emotional reaction it's basically like trying to stop a speeding freight train with a bicycle brake.
That is a perfect analogy.
Because the freight train is your amygdala, your limbic system, roaring down the tracks with millions of years of evolutionary momentum. And your conscious willpower, this dorsal system, is just a flimsy little brake pad.
Right.
Why do we put so much stock in willpower if it's mathematically the weakest tool in the brain?
Well, we put stock in it because it is the only tool we can consciously observe. We can hear our own explicit thoughts, so we overvalue their impact.
Well, that makes sense. We notice it, so we think it's in charge.
Exactly. But the brain's architecture simply doesn't care about your logic when you are under threat. It prioritizes automatic survival responses. The ventral prefrontal cortex acts directly on the limbic system to dampen the alarm. And to complicate matters, these two systems, the implicit ventral and the explicit dorsal, they do not mature at the same time.
Wait, how far apart are we talking?
Years. The regional differentials in myelination and synaptic pruning mean that the ventral areas mature relatively early in human development.
Let me pause you right there. Myelination and pruning. Break that down for us.
Sure. Think of the neurons in your brain like electrical wires.
Okay.
Myelination is the process of wrapping those wires in a fatty, insulating sheath called myelin, which makes the electrical signals travel much faster and much more efficiently.
Like insulating a copper wire.
Exactly. And synaptic pruning is the brain cleaning up unused connections to streamline its network. The ventral areas, the automatic implicit system, they go through this streamlining and insulation process relatively early in life.
But the dorsal areas take longer.
Years longer. The dorsal areas, the conscious, explicit system, take years to finish that myelination process. The hardware for top-down rational control literally isn't finished building until you are well into your 20s.
Okay, that immediately makes me think of teenagers. I mean, society gets so frustrated with adolescents for lacking emotional control, acting out, or being unable to rationalize their feelings.
And that frustration is based on the false assumption that they actually have the equipment to do so.
Right.
Adolescents physically lack the mature dorsal hardware for explicit emotional regulation. They are operating almost entirely on the implicit system and raw, unfiltered limbic reactivity.
So it's not a character flaw.
No. When a teenager is overwhelmed, their brain is doing exactly what its current structural maturity dictates.
That makes total sense when you frame it as a hardware limitation.
Yeah.
But going back to that implicit system, the idea that the brain is automatically deploying countermeasures to protect us without our knowledge, I read the section in the sources about Sigmund Freud, and I have to say, it feels like one of the most stunning plot twists in modern psychology.
Oh, the vindication of Freud is amazing.
Because for decades, strict empirical science treated Freud like a punchline, right?
Right. Freud famously proposed the concept of unconscious defense mechanisms. He argued that our minds automatically protect us from unbearable anxiety by repressing or modifying feelings before they ever reach our conscious awareness.
And people hated that.
For a very long time, behaviorists and empirical scientists mocked this. They called it unmeasurable, unfalsifiable pseudoscience. You couldn't, put a defense mechanism under a microscope.
Because it was just theory. But now we have functional magnetic resonance imaging. We have fMRI scanners.
And when neuroscientists began putting people in fMRI scanners and observing how they managed intense emotional stimuli, they essentially found the physical address of Freud's theory.
That is wild.
Modern researchers in this volume point out that what Freud called defense mechanism is functionally identical to implicit emotion regulation.
How does that actually look on a scan? Like, what is physically happening in the brain when a defense mechanism activates?
So, when a person is exposed to a subconscious threat, researchers can watch the ventral prefrontal cortex light up. This area immediately sends inhibitory signals down to the amygdala and the hypothalamus.
Like slamming the brakes.
Yes. It literally forces your heart rate to stay calm and reduces the release of stress hormones before you even consciously feel the panic. The sympathetic nervous system arousal is forcefully suppressed by the VPFC. That is a defense mechanism in physical action.
So Freud diagnosed the software perfectly. He just lived 100 years too early to see the motherboard.
That's exactly it. He was right about the hardware without ever having a scanner.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
But if our automatic implicit systems are so incredibly powerful and efficient, what happens when they break down? I want to pivot to how this research fundamentally shifts our understanding of depression.
Yeah, this is a major paradigm shift.
Because we have this societal image of what a depressed person looks like. We see lethargy. We see someone who lacks energy. Maybe they can't get out of bed, moving in slow motion. The assumption is that their brain is just powered down.
And that outward lethargy is perhaps the most deceptive behavioral illusion in all of mental health.
Really?
When you actually look inside the skull of a depressed individual, the reality is the exact opposite. If you put a healthy person and a severely depressed person in a brain scanner and ask them to just rest...
Meaning they aren't doing anything.
Right, they aren't performing any cognitive task. They are just staring at a crosshairs on a screen or lying there with their eyes closed. You see a massive divergence. The depressed brain is not powered down. It is running at a terrifyingly high power. It is essentially overheating and cannibalizing itself.
Okay, what is actually overheating? If they were just lying there doing nothing, What machinery is running so hard?
It centers on a neural network called the default mode network, or the DMN.
The DMN.
Right. In a healthy brain, when you stop focusing on an external task like reading a book or having a conversation, the DMN activates. It includes areas like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex.
And what does it normally do?
This is the network responsible for mind-wandering, daydreaming, and self-projection, thinking about your past or imagining your future. It's a very normal, restorative, resting state. But in depressed individuals, the DMN is abnormally hyperactive. It refuses to idle.
So when they sit on the couch to do quote-unquote nothing, their brain doesn't actually rest. It starts obsessively self-projecting.
Specifically, it engages in what we call negative self-referential processing, or more commonly, pathological rumination.
Right, just looping dark thoughts.
When a healthy person rests, their mind might drift to what they want for dinner. When a depressed person rests, their hyperactive DMN relentlessly pulls their attention inward, forcing them to painfully analyze the perceived flaws, past mistakes, and future hopelessness.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. The level of DMN activation actually correlates directly with the severity of their rumination. And here is where it becomes a true biological death spiral. The default mode network teams up with the brain's semantic system.
The semantic system meaning the part of the brain that processes language and meaning.
Yes, the semantic regions, particularly the temporal cortex. They are designed to capture regularities in the outside world and give them meaning. We use them to understand words and concepts.
Okay.
In depression, the semantic system acts as a toxic accomplice to the DMN. Let's look at how a healthy brain processes a negative emotion. A healthy person experiences a flash of sadness or anxiety. The physiological response, the bodily sensation in the chest or stomach, it peaks, and then it naturally fades over a few minutes.
Like a wave passing through.
Exactly. But in a depressed brain, the semantic system grabs that fleeting physiological feeling and verbalizes it. It takes a temporary bodily sensation and translates it into a permanent, looping internal dialogue.
So it's talking to itself.
It says, I feel heavy right now, which means I am a failure, which means I will always feel this way, which means my life is over.
Wow. So it's weaponizing language against the body. If you are listening to this and you've ever tried to think your way out of a depressive episode, you might actually be throwing gasoline on the fire.
You absolutely are.
Because you're using the exact semantic system, the language processor, that is trapping you in the first place. It's like leaving a car in neutral but redlining the engine until it explodes. You aren't going anywhere, but the internal machinery is literally tearing itself apart.
The brain is attempting to solve an emotional, physiological problem using a cognitive language-based tool.
And it doesn't work.
No, because emotions are primarily physiological events. They aren't designed to be solved by language in that moment. By verbalizing the sadness, by turning it into a semantic story about your identity, the temporal cortex artificially extends the lifespan of the emotional pain.
It's a biological trap.
A total trap. The excessive focus on the self, driven by the DMN and narrated by the semantic system, creates a closed loop. The brain is constantly generating the very distress it's trying to escape.
That reframes rumination entirely. It's not a character flaw or a sign of weakness. It's a mechanical malfunction of the resting state interacting with the language center.
Exactly.
But speaking of how we use language and expression to cope, this brings up a huge societal debate about how we handle our feelings outwardly. On one hand, modern therapy culture tells us, suppressing your feelings is toxic. You need to let it out.
Right, the express everything model.
Yeah. On the other hand, we have traditional norms, like boys don't cry, which encourages stoicism. We also tend to assume that outgoing, highly social, extroverted people are the most emotionally resilient because they express themselves so freely.
Well, the electrophysiological data presented in the text proves that many of those societal assumptions are completely backward, or at least far more complicated than we thought.
Also.
To understand this, we have to look at event-related potential studies, or ERPs, specifically focusing on something called expressive suppression.
Let's define the tools here first. What exactly is an ERP study looking at?
An ERP is a measurement of the electrical activity in your brain in response to a specific event, broken down into milliseconds.
So they measure the exact timing of a reaction.
Right. Subjects wear a cap covered in electrodes, and researchers show them a stimulus, usually a graphic or highly distressing image, and measure the exact timeline of the brain's electrical reaction. It allows us to see the emotion unfold in real time.
Okay.
Researchers in this field look specifically at a marker called the late positive potential, or LPP.
So the LPP is the electrical signature of the emotion itself.
It is a direct physiological marker of emotional arousal. When you see something distressing, your LPP spikes. The higher the LPP wave amplitude, the more intense the emotional arousal you are experiencing inside your head.
Got it.
So researchers designed a study to see what happens to that electrical spike when people are explicitly told to hide their feelings. They show participants negative images and instruct them to suppress their facial expressions completely so an observer wouldn't know they are upset.
They're forcing them to be stoic.
Exactly.
And when they looked at the brain waves during that stoicism, the results were totally split by gender, right?
The divergence was remarkable. They looked at the time window of 2,000 to 4,000 milliseconds after the image was shown. Men who were instructed to suppress their expressions showed a massive, significant drop in their LPP brainwaves.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The electrical amplitude pulled downward. Their internal emotional arousal actually plummeted when they kept a straight face.
So what about the women?
Women who were instructed to suppress showed no such drop. Their LPP brainwaves stayed high.
Wait, I really want to make sure I'm understanding this. Society has this often toxic masculine norm where men are told to suck it up and hide their emotions.
Yeah.
Are you saying that social conditioning has actually provided men with a biological loophole? Like they get a physiological discount on their emotional pain just by keeping a straight face?
The prevailing theory among the researchers is exactly that. Because men are socialized from a very young age to suppress their emotions, to adhere to masculine norms, their brains have essentially automated the process over years of practice.
Wow.
It has become a highly efficient, implicit regulatory strategy. For these men, hiding the emotion on the outside actually turns down the electrical volume on the inside.
And for women?
Women, who are typically socialized by society to be more emotionally expressive, haven't automated that specific suppression pathway to the same degree, so they don't get that same physiological relief from forced stoicism. Their brain is still firing on all cylinders, even if their face is blank.
That is fascinating. But the text also drops a massive twist on this data. This male advantage in suppression doesn't apply to everyone. Personality completely overrides gender here.
Right, it gets even more complex. The researchers added a personality dimension to the study, measuring where participants fell on the introversion-extroversion scale. They found that the male advantage in suppression only works for what we might call ambiverts.
Like people who fall somewhere in the middle of the scale.
Yes, your average, moderately social person. But when they looked at highly extroverted people, and this applies to both men and women, the suppression strategy failed catastrophically.
Catastrophically. What happened to their LPP waves?
When extroverts were forced to suppress a negative emotion, their LPP brainwaves did not drop at all. In fact, if you look at the early window, the middle window, and the late window, their brain is screaming with emotional arousal.
Even though their face is neutral.
Exactly. The suppression did absolutely nothing to reduce the electrical storm, despite them maintaining a neutral face.
So let's translate this to real life. The life of the party, the highly social, outgoing person who is always expressing themselves. We often assume they're robust and resilient. But if an extrovert is put in a crisis situation where they are forced to bite their tongue and suppress a negative emotion, they're basically biologically defenseless. Their emotional brakes are completely stripped.
Extroverts are characterized by a very strong innate tendency toward emotional expression. Their neural architecture is heavily hardwired to broadcast how they feel to their social group.
Right.
When you force an extrovert's prefrontal inhibitory networks into lockdown, when you tell them, do not show any emotion, hold it in, they hit massive internal resistance. Their system is designed to expel the emotional energy, not contain it.
Wow.
So while an ambivert man might successfully calm his internal state by going stoic, an extrovert who tries to go stoic is just trapping an unmitigated electrical storm inside their head.
It's like plugging the exhaust pipe of a running engine. The pressure just builds and builds. That is a terrifying thought if you are an extrovert in a high-stakes professional environment where you have to keep your cool.
It highlights why a one-size-fits-all approach to emotional advice, like just hold it together or just let it out, is neurologically unsound.
Which brings up another fascinating divergence in neurological profiles. Let's look at the research surrounding the autistic mind. Our standard societal perception of autism is defined almost entirely by deficits.
Yes, mostly social deficits.
Right. We think of deficits in social empathy, difficulty making eye contact, and severe challenges with emotional regulation. But those exact traits seem to unlock a bizarre and powerful cognitive superpower that neurotypical brains cannot access.
This section of the research is truly paradigm shifting. It involves individuals with high autistic traits, which researchers measure using the Autism Spectrum Quotient, or AQ. As you noted, a core diagnostic challenge for those on the spectrum is processing complex social and emotional information. But the human brain is incredibly plastic. To compensate for this emotional blindness in social situations, individuals with high AQ develop an enhanced, almost hyper-tuned ability to process abstract, highly theoretical information.
When you say abstract theoretical information, what kind of things are we talking about? Like math?
The researchers use specific vocabulary words to test this. They use words that are normally considered cold, empty of sensory data, and purely logical. Words like axiom, consistency, paradigm, or even abstract emotional concepts like anguish.
Right, because if you say the word apple, I can instantly picture a red apple that has high visual data. But if you say the word axiom, I understand the definition, but my brain doesn't paint a picture of an axiom.
Neurotypical brains process axiom almost entirely in the semantic system. It remains abstract. But the researchers tested something called imageability. Yes, it's a rating of how easily a word can be transformed into a vivid mental image. They found that individuals with high autistic traits, particularly males with high AQ, possess an uncanny ability to take those cold, theoretical words and process them as vivid sensory images.
They literally see it.
Yes.
Yeah.
The higher their AQ, the higher they rated the imageability of these abstract concepts.
So they literally rebuild abstract logic as a visual world in their minds.
Exactly. They use their heightened perceptual and visual spatial networks to process concepts that most of us can only grasp semantically. They compensate for missing social emotional data by translating the abstract into the concrete.
That is amazing.
And what's staggering is how predictive this cognitive quirk is. The researchers took this data and built a decision tree model to see if they could predict a person's autism quotient just based on how they process vocabulary.
And could they?
With remarkable accuracy. The model showed that if a person's average imageability rating for theoretical words was above a certain threshold, they almost certainly had a high AQ. They even broke it down to the word level.
Really? Just one word?
By simply looking at how intensely your brain visualizes the abstract word anguish. Specifically, if your rating falls below 5.55 on their scale, you flow into a higher AQ diagnostic branch. World-class researchers can literally look at how your brain processes the word anguish and predict with high significance whether you cross the clinical threshold for autism.
That is mind-bending. A researcher can look at how you define a single word and map your neurological operating system. It's like they found a back door to the brain.
It really is.
Now, on the flip side of that, the sources also discuss neurotypical people who exhibit high levels of hostility. We all know people like this, people who are always lashing out, highly aggressive in the workplace, just always ready for a fight.
Yes, trait hostility.
We tend to view them through a moral lens, right? We think of them as just being bad people or malicious. But the neuroscience suggests they aren't necessarily evil. They're just missing a single cognitive bridge.
This is a crucial finding for how we manage antisocial behavior. We have known for a long time that poor emotion regulation is strongly correlated with hostility. When you cannot regulate your own negative feelings, you are easily frustrated and you tend to act out against others.
Which makes sense.
But a major study of 360 adults looked specifically at what mediates that pathway. Why does internal frustration turn into external hostility? And they found it hinges entirely on one specific cognitive function: perspective taking.
The ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes.
The ability to cognitively step outside your own immediate experience and imagine how another person is viewing the situation. The study proved that perspective taking is the sole circuit breaker in the hostility pathway.
The sole circuit breaker?
Yes. If an individual has severe difficulty regulating their emotions, meaning they get intensely frustrated and angry easily, but they retain the cognitive ability to take another's perspective, that hostility pathway is significantly blocked.
So it's like a neurological missing puzzle piece. If you can't emotionally regulate, your brain defaults to hostility, unless the perspective-taking software is installed and running. Empathy isn't just a moral choice to be a good person, it's an actual cognitive transmission block. Without it, frustration just goes straight to the wheels as aggressive behavior.
The data showed a very strong positive correlation between emotion regulation difficulties and hostility, but that perspective-taking middleman was the only thing that could partially interrupt and dissolve that hostile transmission.
It totally changes how we view aggressive behavior.
It does. The emotional dysregulation generates the internal heat, but the lack of perspective-taking removes the firewall, allowing that heat to burn everyone else in the room.
Speaking of internal heat and dysregulation, let's look at the next part of our outline, which deals with anxiety. Because anxiety is also a massive failure of a specific cognitive system. I want to talk about how anxious people remember danger, because the contradiction here is just fascinating.
It's a very cruel biological trick.
Anxious people are famously hypervigilant. If they walk into a crowded room, they will instantly spot the one person who looks angry or threatening. But their memory system plays this twisted trick on them where they become terrified of everything because they lose the ability to remember where the danger actually was.
To unpack this, we need to return to the ERP brainwave methodology we discussed earlier, but this time looking at individuals with high trait anxiety. Researchers wanted to see how anxious brains process and encode memories of threats.
Okay.
So they showed participants images of fearful faces within a specific context and measured the electrical activity in two distinct time windows.
What happens in the first window?
The first window is the early processing stage, occurring between 500 and 700 milliseconds after the fearful face is shown. We call this the late positive component, or LPC.
Okay, early window, LPC.
In a healthy brain, there is a moderate response. But in the highly anxious brain, this early window shows a massive enhanced spike in electrical activity. The brain captures the scary face instantly. It is highly attuned to the familiarity of the threat. It sounds the alarm. Danger is here.
Okay, so the radar works perfectly, almost too perfectly. They see the threat faster and more intensely than anyone else.
But the tragedy happens in the late processing window, which occurs between 700 and 1200 milliseconds. We call this the late slow wave, or LSW.
And what's supposed to happen then?
In a healthy brain, this is the stage of source memory and elaborative encoding. This is when the brain traces back the context of the threat. It says, okay, I see a fearful face, but I am sitting in a laboratory looking at a computer screen, so I am safe.
It grounds the fear in reality. It gives it context.
Exactly. But in the highly anxious brain, in that 700 to 1200 millisecond window, the ERP amplitude for source retrieval completely drops off. The electrical activity plummets. The brain actively shuts down the source retrieval process when confronted with a fearful stimulus.
Why on earth would the brain do that? Why would it go blind exactly when it needs to figure out where the threat is coming from?
The researchers concluded it is a mechanism of strategic avoidance caused by emotional overload. The initial spike of fear in the early 500 to 700 millisecond window is so intense, so overwhelming to their nervous system, that the brain simply cannot handle any more processing.
It just taps out.
Right. To protect itself from fully experiencing the depth of that negative emotion, it refuses to deeply process the context. It aborts the memory encoding.
Wow. It's like having a home security system that blasts a deafening alarm, but the monitor screen that tells you which window was actually broken goes completely blank. You just live in constant panic, feeling the fear but lacking the data to solve it or turn the alarm off.
And this perfectly encapsulates the biological trap of generalized anxiety disorder. The anxious person desperately wants to feel safe and secure, but because their brain favors early automatic threat detection and then actively avoids the time-consuming elaborative processing that would provide context, they rob themselves of the very information that would prove they are safe.
That is heartbreaking.
By refusing to process the source of the threat, they guarantee they will never feel secure. They remember the fear vividly, but they lose the map of where it belongs.
It's a biological catch-22. But thankfully, this brings us to how we actually fix these broken systems. For decades, science taught us that this kind of hardwired fear was a life sentence. If your brain learned to fear something, that neural pathway was permanent, right? It was etched in stone, and the best you could do was try to cope with it.
That was the absolute consensus in neuroscience until the late 1990s. The belief was that once emotional learning took place, once your amygdala associated a specific trigger with fear, it was forever. The only thing therapy could do was a process called extinction.
Extinction meaning you try to overwrite it?
You try to build a new, stronger pathway over the old one. You try to teach the brain a new association. This dog won't bite you, this elevator won't trap you, but the old fear pathway was still physically there, lurking underneath.
Which is why people relapse.
That is why relapse was so incredibly common. People would be fine for years, and then one stressful event would bring the original phobia rushing back.
But the sources we are looking at outline a total paradigm shift. We can now literally erase fear from the physical brain. Delete it.
We can. This brings us to a specific clinical approach discussed in the text. Emotion regulation therapy, or EAR. EAR was designed specifically for what they call distress disorders. This is where things like generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder co-occur.
And they co-occur a lot, right?
At a staggering rate, clinically between 40 and 72% of the time.
Up to 72%. Why are anxiety and depression so intimately linked? We usually think of them as opposites, like anxiety is too much energy, depression is too little.
They are two sides of the same coin, driven by a massive imbalance in the brain's motivational systems. The brain has a prevention and safety system and a promotion and reward system.
Okay.
In distress disorders, the safety system is so wildly overactivated, constantly looking for threats, constantly sounding the alarm, that it completely suffocates and shuts down the reward system. The person is so chronically focused on not dying or not failing that they become entirely incapable of pursuing goals or feeling pleasure.
So how does ER fix that imbalance? I saw the case study in the text about Loris. Can you walk us through how that works in practice?
The case of Loris is a perfect example. She was a 28-year-old financial executive, highly educated with a master's degree, but she had this paralyzing issue. She was trying to take her CFA certification exam, but for years she would register and then completely avoid studying or taking the test.
Because her prevention system was in overdrive.
Yes. If we look at the chain analysis of her behavior, the trigger event was the thought of the CFA exam. This immediately caused massive emotional arousal, high anxiety, and profound sadness. Her brain then engaged in reactive self-referential processing, the rumination we discussed earlier.
The semantic loop.
Right. She would tell herself, I'm going to fail, I'm an imposter. The emotional pain was so high that her only escape was behavioral avoidance. She would quit. The E4T intervention doesn't just try to logically convince her she's smart. It uses the neurobiology of memory reconsolidation to change the physical structure of her fear.
Memory reconsolidation. This is the part that sounds like science fiction to me. How do you physically change a memory?
Scientists discovered that a memory is not a permanent read-only file. If you reactivate a traumatic or fearful memory, if you bring it fully to mind and experience the emotion, there is a brief window where that memory enters a labile or plastic unstable state. The protein synthesis that holds the memory together becomes fluid again.
It's like opening a read-only document and suddenly having the ability to edit the text.
That is functionally what is happening. If, during that specific window of instability, you provide the brain with a contradictory emotional experience, an experience of profound safety or an unexpected positive outcome, the emotional root of that memory is chemically erased.
Erased.
Completely. The proteins that hold the fear association together are broken down and resynthesized without the fear. The memory of the event remains. You still remember the dog or the exam, but the emotional charge is gone.
The brain is rewritten at the synaptic level.
Exactly. Through ERT, Loris was guided to confront the imagery of the exam while being physically anchored in a state of safety and regulation with the therapist. Over time, her performance on cognitive conflict tasks returned to the level of a healthy control group. The fear bond was broken. This is a massive shift from older behavioral therapies.
The text makes a really interesting comparison here between something like dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, and schema therapy regarding how they handle this.
Yes. When treating severe dysregulation, like borderline personality disorder, these two therapies take different routes. DBT focuses heavily on direct behavioral skill acquisition. It trains the explicit system.
Like giving you coping tools.
It teaches you how to modulate your reaction when you get triggered to reduce self-harm. But schema therapy, or ST, goes deeper into the implicit system. It uses a technique called imagery rescripting to actually enter those childhood trauma memories activate them into that unstable state, and use the therapist to provide the missing emotional nurture.
Wow.
ST is actively trying to trigger memory reconsolidation to change the source mechanism, while DBT is managing the symptoms.
So it's not just coping anymore. You aren't just learning to breathe through the panic. Experiential therapies are actually triggering this reconsolidation. They are physically reconstructing the neurology. But that raises a massive logistical question. How does a therapist provide that necessary safety? How do they convince a hypervigilant, overheating brain that it's actually safe to edit that file? That brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the in-sync model. Because the way healing actually happens is another huge face slap to modern society.
It really challenges how we live today.
In the age of telehealth, Zoom therapy, and AI chatbots, we tend to think psychological healing is just a data transfer. I log on, I tell you my problems, you give me smart advice, and I feel better.
But true healing is not an exchange of cognitive information. According to the interpersonal synchrony, or in-sync model, true healing is a physical, biological resonance between two bodies in the same room.
Explain that. What do you mean by biological resonance?
We talked earlier about the implicit emotion regulation system, the ventral prefrontal cortex, which handles 90% of your emotional life automatically. Language and logic barely touch that system. To heal that deep unconscious system, you need a process called co-regulation.
Co-regulation. Regulating together.
Yes. The in-sync model outlines 3 levels of this. The first level is sensoromotor. During successful psychotherapy, when a patient and therapist are physically in the same room, they literally physically synchronize.
Like they move the same way.
Researchers have recorded sessions and found that without either of them realizing it, their head movements match, their body postures align, their breathing rates begin to mirror each other. It is significantly higher than random baseline movements.
Just naturally mirroring each other's physical form.
But then it moves to the second level, complex cognitive and physiological alignment. Their skin conductance, the measure of micro-sweat and sympathetic arousal, syncs up in real time.
They sweat at the same time.
Yes, this physiological syncing directly predicts how highly the patient will rate the therapist's empathy. If the therapist stays grounded and calm, the patient's nervous system detects that biological safety and chemically downregulates to match it. And the most staggering evidence for this comes from EEG hyperscanning.
Hyperscanning.
Yep.
Meaning scanning both brains simultaneously during a session.
Yes, both the patient and therapist wear EEG caps while they talk, and what the data shows is profound. During moments of high empathy, their prefrontal cortex brainwaves form a symphony of neural oscillation. They literally measure phase locking in the neural frequencies.
That sounds like magic.
When the therapist exhibits empathy, their brainwaves and the patient's brainwaves couple. They synchronize. You aren't just talking to a therapist, your brain is temporarily plugging into theirs to borrow their regulatory hardware.
Hold on. So a great therapist isn't just someone with a frame degree on the wall and a list of smart advice. They are essentially a biological tuning fork.
Exactly, a biological tuning fork.
If they vibrate at a calm, regulated frequency, the patient's chaotic, anxious brainwaves are physically forced to match that rhythm. They use the therapist's healthy prefrontal cortex to stabilize their own overheating default mode network.
That is the absolute essence of the in-sync model. And this leads to the third level, internalization. Over months of borrowing the therapist's regulatory hardware, the patient's brain physically changes, internalizing that calming effect so they can eventually self-regulate.
It is amazing.
But the absolute key here is that this requires flesh and blood. It requires nonverbal physiological cues, microexpressions, spatial resonance, pheromones, shared atmospheric processing that simply cannot be transmitted through text messages or an AI algorithm. The implicit system responds to physical presence.
Which brings us to what this all means for us today. We have covered so much ground. We've shattered the myth of willpower and seen how the conscious mind is often just a bystander in the brain's internal civil war between the ventral and dorsal systems.
All right.
We've seen how extroverts can be biologically trapped by their own outgoing nature when forced to suppress their emotions. We've looked at the overheating engine of the depressed brain's default mode network and how fear can literally be deleted from the hard drive through memory reconsolidation.
The overarching lesson here is that emotion regulation is not about being stoic. It's about understanding the silent, mechanical laws of our neurobiology.
And that leaves us with a chilling question to end on. A final, provocative thought for you to carry with you. We just established through hard electrophysiological data that millions of years of evolution designed our brains to heal and regulate by physically synchronizing with another human body in the same room. Our nervous systems literally plug into each other to find safety.
It is our most fundamental primitive survival mechanism. Without that level 1 physical synchrony, the deeper regulatory healing struggles to take root.
Yet look at the world we are building right now. We are rapidly moving our entire lives, our friendships, our romantic relationships, and even our therapy onto isolated electronic screens. The data already shows that unguided online therapy has massive dropout rates compared to in-person sessions. We are replacing biological tuning forks with text messages and AI avatars. So ask yourself this: if we completely sever this physical brain-to-brain synchrony, are we actively dismantling the only biological antidote to anxiety we've ever had? By isolating ourselves behind glass screens, are we engineering our own permanent dysregulation? Keep that in mind the next time you choose a text over a coffee. The diagnosis of the human condition isn't clean, but the cure requires us to actually be in the room together. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.